With that, I'd like to return to the program itself and announce the second lecture given by Christina Bloomer. And Christina Bloomer has a PhD from the Center of Cognitive Neuroscience at the Paris Lodron University of Salzburg in Austria, with a thesis on circadian variations in consciousness in relation to healthy sleep and brain-injured patients. Christina is a sleep scientist currently working at the Center for Chronobiology of the University of Basel and its psychiatric hospital in Switzerland. And she's interested in research around circadian rhythms and cognitive processing during healthy sleep and in patients with disorders of consciousness due to severe brain injury. And currently she is focusing on the effects of natural daylight and artificial light on sleep. And besides doing research, she's also active as a freelance science communication trainer. Christina, please start sharing the screen, and I look forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Luke. I think you have, yeah, to stop sharing your screen.
Should work now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much again for this very kind introduction, and I'm very much looking forward to now giving my presentation on bright days and how daylight actually benefits health. And it's going to be a bit less technical because I think most of us don't always walk around with a lux meter or even a spectrometer and are able to measure the light we actually have. But I think we can safely say the more the better when it comes to daylight. Just beware of sunburns. Yeah. So in this talk, I would like to give you an overview of what we know from a scientific perspective about the beneficial effects of daylight on attention and performance, but then also sleep and the biological clock, and last but not least, mood. Now, I think what we have to keep in mind is that life on Earth has evolved under the light of the sun, and many biological processes follow this rhythmic pattern of light and darkness, or sunrise and sunset. And in scientific terms, these rhythms with a period length of about 24 hours, that is, rhythms that begin anew about every 24 hours, we call them circadian rhythms. So what is clear is that our body's biological timing system has sort of evolved under the open sky and is therefore also optimally tuned to the conditions we find outside. Of course, we haven't evolved in offices or closed rooms. And from this perspective also, a modern lifestyle, one could perhaps even say lifestyle, can be challenging for our bodies and our internal rhythms. And this has been very nicely illustrated in a video on YouTube, which I can highly recommend watching, published by the University of Surrey the other day. It's called "Why Do We Sleep So Late?" And this is actually a screenshot which illustrates the difference between ancestral patterns of light and a modern light pattern. And what becomes obvious, I think, is that in the ancestral pattern, our ancestors had a lot of light exposure during the day, but then also very low light levels in the evening, during the night, or close to no light at all. While in a modern environment, generally this curve is dampened, so we have relatively less light during the day because we spend a lot of time indoors, but then relatively a lot of light in comparison to the ancestral pattern, even in the evenings. And one factor that contributes to this is, of course, that we spend a lot of time inside buildings, in offices, or in living rooms, at least since the start of the pandemic, which are associated with lower luminance levels. And I would like to emphasize that sometimes we may not perceive illuminance levels indoors and outdoors to be very different, for example, on grey and overcast days, but they are significantly different. So light levels outdoors are usually never comparable to what we experience indoors. And one aspect, in addition to illuminance, is that artificial light and natural light have different spectral characteristics. And I've tried to illustrate this with these piles of balls here, where you see that natural light, the composition of natural light with regard to a spectral range, where here each ball represents a different, or each color represents a different spectral range. Their natural light and artificial light are just different. So also from a spectral perspective, natural daylight and artificial light are often not comparable, or usually not comparable, and this is also what Luke has already just shown you in a bit more of a technical fashion. Now, of course, it's for most of us not possible to go back to this ancestral pattern, because we live in a modern society and a modern environment, and usually we can't just move our offices to the garden. But then often just being conscious about one's lifestyle and a favorable light environment is already a fast step towards improving this lifestyle. And today I would like to give you an overview of the reasons why we should all pay more attention to this lifestyle or our light environment. And I would like to first talk about beneficial effects of daylight on alertness and performance, but then also the biological clock and sleep, and last also mood. So when we talk about alertness and performance, then, for example, there was one study that looked at improved office light compared to standard office light, and I here put 2 pictures of these light environments, and I have to admit I still find it quite dark, at least what I can tell from looking at the pictures. But the main difference is that in the upper photo here, they had these black blinds, so when the sun came round, they just had to they covered the window with these black blinds, whereas they had a tinted or a natural tinting glass in the improved office light condition. And even though we might say perhaps even this is not ideal, then what they found was that performance was improved on what they call higher order decision-making task. And it was by an impressive 42%. So they were 42% better. And if you now ask yourself what a higher order decision-making task actually is, I asked myself the same, so I looked it up. So in this study, they used a simulation. So participants sat in front of a computer and sort of, it must have been like a game. So they had the simulation where they were put in a strategic position, such as a city mayor or an emergency planner, for about 90 minutes. And in this position, they had to respond to events, and then apparently their performance was sort of ranked and evaluated. And they performed better in the improved office light condition. And this is not very well in line with also other studies. For example, there was one controlled study where they had blue enriched white light. So for those who know these technical terms a bit better, that was about 17,000 Kelvin, and compare that to standard white office light, which was at about 4,000 Kelvin. And here they asked office workers to report alertness, concentration, performance, but also sleepiness. And it became obvious that in the blue enriched white light condition, they improved on all parameters. So they felt a lot better and more alert, and were able to better perform, and also felt less sleepy. So from this, it seems clear that more daylight has beneficial effects on alertness and performance. We can then also take this a step further and ask ourselves, for example, how does that, how are the results in care homes for elderly people? And there was one study that used similar settings, and here in a care home with elderly people with cognitive deficits, we however have to say that the effects were not only beneficial, so alertness and performance were unchanged. Daytime activity was actually increased, which, well, is something beneficial, but then sleep deteriorated. So in some, let's say, vulnerable populations, we might be a bit cautious with regard to changing the light environment. Yeah. Then let's move on to the biological clock and sleep. And also there we have to say that more daylight generally has beneficial effects on the biological clock and sleep. And the two aspects are of course closely linked. So when we talk about the biological clock, this mainly considers the timing of sleep. And in the laboratory, this is also often assessed with the measurement of melatonin. So melatonin is the hormone of darkness, not the hormone of sleep, I have to emphasize, the hormone of darkness, which helps us fall asleep, and whose secretion starts in the evening about 2 to 3 hours before habitual bedtime. And I would like to emphasize that it helps us to fall asleep, but it's not comparable to a sleeping pill, although some advertisements might differ from that. And the time span during which melatonin is secreted in the pineal gland in our brains is also sometimes called the biological night. Now, more daylight is associated with the biological night starting earlier. And although, as we will also hear in the next talk, daylight is not the only factor that is involved here, and melatonin alone is not sufficient, and by the way, not even necessary for sleep. It is possible that the biological night, as measured by melatonin secretion, starting earlier, also makes us tired earlier, and that would give us the option for more sleep. And indeed, what we also see is that people do feel more tired in the evening, so evening fatigue is increased. And we also see the effects on a behavioral level. So we could say we become a little more lark-like, to stay in this picture, and a little less owl-like. And in addition to that, a strong day signal seems to protect us against the undesirable effects of light at night, specifically when we talk about melatonin suppression by artificial light, which might make it more difficult to sleep at the right time. So here, a strong day signal through daylight really benefits sleep timing, benefits the biological clock, and this way also sleep. Now we can also look at how daylight affects experienced sleep quality on the one hand, but then also objective sleep measures, which we're able to assess in the lab on the other hand. And in some studies several studies have found daylight to benefit self-reported sleep quality. Aspects of which are, for example, decreased sleep onset latency, so the time it takes to fall asleep, but also sleep duration. But as we saw on the previous slide, sleep duration is then also again linked to the biological clock and sleep timing. And interestingly, also when we objectively assess sleep in the sleep laboratory by measurements and many electrodes on the head and the face, then also daylight has effects we'd consider as positive. So the proportions of deep sleep, or we could also sometimes paraphrase this as the intensity of sleep, is increased. Although we also have to say that the relationship between objective sleep markers and the experienced sleep quality is usually not very strong in studies. This is, of course, something we as sleep experts would say is good. And then many of these studies have been done in healthy sleepers. And of course, we might ask, well, what happens in patients with insomnia? So patients suffering from severe problems, falling asleep and staying asleep, or patients who do not experience sleep to be restorative and refreshing. And even in these patients, light therapy has been found to have beneficial effects. I think we also have to say that light therapy is not going to be the solution for insomnia, because simply there are other factors involved as well, including cognitive and behavioral effects or factors. So even though daylight is not a cure for insomnia, it usually comes without side effects, and it has beneficial effects in insomnia. So I would always recommend to use it in addition to other therapeutic measures. And daylight also has beneficial effects beyond sleep, for example, on mood. So light therapy has proven beneficial in a range of disorders, especially also involving mood. So it is especially well known as an effective and often adjunct therapy or treatment in depression, but has even been shown helpful in, for example, ADHD or some neurodegenerative disorders. The precise mechanisms, so how this actually is brought about, are not yet entirely clear, but mechanisms that are discussed are that light therapy might increase the availability of neurotransmitters such as serotonin, that light therapy might stabilize circadian rhythms and improve the synchronization between the light-dark cycle, so the external light-dark cycle, and biological processes, and that this has beneficial effects. And then also, of course, improvements in mood might be brought about by improved sleep. So this is actually a very interesting meta-analysis here, where the authors were able to show that improving sleep also ameliorates psychiatric symptoms. And I would like to conclude by just emphasizing again that improving the lifestyle and increasing daylight or exposure to natural daylight, or if that is not possible, also light therapy can really benefit performance and alertness. Also, the synchronization between biological processes and the external environment, it can benefit sleep, but also mood. And one aspect I just also have to mention is that we should be cautious, especially if we or you take photosensitizing drugs, and that includes St. John's wort, which is sometimes used in depression, but also certain antibiotics might render you very light sensitive, and then we just have to be careful. And with this, I would like to finish, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Christina, for a nice overview of all kinds of findings and scientific proof points of cases where indeed, daytime light exposure and light therapy are definitely beneficial to people in all kinds of circumstances.